Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Watching to see if we've got more midshipmen trickling in. Good afternoon, I'm Commander B.J. Armstrong. I'm the Principal Associate of the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies here at the Naval Academy. I'd like to welcome you to our first lecture in our second year of First Bell Lectures in Naval Leadership and History. This is a series that's a joint initiative between FINHSS and the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership here at the Academy. The Stockdale Center serves as a valuable resource within the Naval Academy community and its students that aims to empower leaders to make courageous and ethical decisions. And FINHSS, or the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies, is a new initiative of the History Department here at the Academy. We founded it at the start of last year to develop our collective understanding of the naval past and to encourage collaboration in the wider field of seapower studies. The Stockdale Center and FINHSS would both like to thank William C. Stutt, USNA class of 1949, for his generous donation that supports the lecture series and our work together. Today, we're joined by Dr. Regina Akers from Naval History and Heritage Command. Dr. Akers is a subject matter expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion with an emphasis on women and African Americans in the U.S. Navy. She's also a leader in the field of oral history here in the United States. Her publications include book chapters, articles, blogs, and encyclopedia entries. And she's worked on the African American Civil War Sailor Project, as well as the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Task Force. Dr. Akers is an adjunct professor teaching women's and public history at Howard University and has been a commentator for documentaries and served on the team that developed the documentary for the 150th anniversary of African Americans at the Naval Academy. Today's lecture is based on her most recent monograph, The Navy's First Enlisted Women Patriot Pioneers, which was published by NHHC in 2019, and which from the flyer that you all received in your email, you can click the link and download for free as an ebook as well, if you remain interested after her great talk today. So without further ado, Dr. Akers.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for making time out of, I'm sure, your very busy days to hear a little bit about these pioneering women. I was at home decluttering, thinking I was doing a good thing, and somehow or another I twisted my knee, which has gotten progressively worse, but the show must go on, so that's why you see me have the cane for extra support, but it's all good. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, BJ. To talk, this presentation sort of takes highlights from the pamphlet. And we have less than an hour, so that's another reason why it's condensed. But if you have additional questions or anything, I'll have my contact information, and I'm in the Global, and I'd be glad to address those. Or if you have other aspects, hopefully the Q&A will also give us opportunity. Also, disclaimer, my comments and views are mine and mine alone, and may or may not reflect any component of the Department of Defense. See, you all are smiling, you do it too. The Department of Defense or any component thereof. Next. That's my contact information. Most, if you go through mail, that's really slow. Email's the best way to reach me. I also want to acknowledge the support of two of my colleagues who did a peer review. My boss, Mr. Charles Webdeen, is here, and Dr. John Fahey was kind enough to join us, so thank you all as well. Next. All right, Secretary of Navy Josephus Daniels. When World War I was imminent, that Secretary Daniels learned from the Civil Service Commission that Civil Service that they could not provide the manpower that he needed for the projected needs, especially for clerical support. So he consulted with his legal team, who discovered there was something called a Naval Reserve Act of 1916 that said any U.S. citizen could enlist. Therefore, he instructed the Bureau of Navigation, which we know today is the Bureau of Naval Personnel, it was renamed in 1942, to start enlisting women. Again, primarily for clerical support. And that's a nice painting of Daniels from our collection. Next. So what were the requirements? U.S. citizenship. They had to complete an application. They had to be interviewed. They had some very awkward physical exams. Very awkward, if you can imagine, and how they did them. Also, if they had a skill that was urgently needed, like shorthand or typing, sometimes they would test it right there on site. The need was that acute. Having met those requirements, they took the oath of office, the same as their male counterparts. They would receive an identification card, and most of them returned home until the Navy issued their orders. Now again, an urgently needed skill set meant that some percentage of them would report for duty that day in some cases in their civilian attire. You might have heard the name Loretta Perfectus Walsh of Oliphant, Pennsylvania, became the Navy's first enlisted woman. The Navy will recruit 11,000 plus women from every state, territory, and the nation's capital. Most of them will serve in D.C. Now, how do you distinguish these yeomen from the male yeomen? So the Navy came with a relatively simple idea. We're going to designate them yeoman and F period in parentheses, so that if someone's reporting to them, they know whether it's a female or a male. But that was their simple answer to that. And that's how they officially designated them. So why enlist? Patriotism, number one reason. Desire to do something different. Wanting to end the war sooner. Several of them were recruited by someone else in naval service. Also, the adventure of it, and in the historical context of this time with, factory workers and all those bad conditions, equal pay for equal work drew them. The Navy pays by rank, not gender. Also, there were suffragists. I wish we had more time, but anyway, the Marine Corps will also recruit 305 women. Coast Guard will recruit 3. Now, you might be asking, what about the Army? One of my reviewers did. The Army did not, they were still debating the issue by the time the war ended. Now, they had nurses because the Nurse Corps was established in 1901, but they didn't have enlisted women until World War II. Next. Uniforms. This Norfolk style jacket that this became quite a point of contention for some of the yeomen who just did not like this uniform at all. But like good sailors, they wore it as they did their duties, most of them. Women will serve, as I said, in civilian attire until the Navy provided uniforms, but there was no effort to figure out how we're going to produce uniforms for these women. They just said we're going to enlist them. So they're catching up with themselves in the first couple of months of their participation in the war. So here are 2 examples. You see the navy blues on your left, and on the left and on the right, you see the whites that were worn. You've also seen pictures of them with those big capes on. They look like Darth Vader or something. They didn't like that either, but consider the time. This is the Gilded Age, and you were supposed to cover for, we don't have time. Anyway, eventually the department stores, the Navy will put the uniforms in the department stores and they'll be able to buy them directly. Now, there were some yeomen who had such duties that this uniform was just not practical for. And so you'll see pictures of those yeomen wearing overalls, believe it or not. Those who work with ammunitions. The old denim overalls, that's what they wore, not this uniform. Next. So, as I said, the Navy's catching up. The first female yeomen are going to have to learn the job, learn their skills and what's required of them on the job, literally on the job. Eventually, naval commands will provide some sort of instruction after work. Now, think about that long day. The other thing they had to learn after work was how to drill, as you see here. Now, there's a Navy recruiting station, which was previously, in fact, it was the Navy's first hospital in D.C. during the Civil War. That was a recruiting station for the Navy at 10th and Pennsylvania Avenue in the Southeast. If you know D.C., it's right down from Eastern Market. Anyway, they provided classes there where the women could learn naval terms, ships, etc. The Navy also had what they called instructional materials and memos. Yes, you heard me right. But if you don't have the context, it's a little hard to learn, but that's what they did. And this was the effort. This was the effort that they made to, as these women are working, to teach them the Navy way of doing things. Here you'll see new enlistees receiving training in telegraphy from Chief Petty Officer at Naval Training Center, Great Lakes, which was newly opened, by the way. You'll note that some of the women are in uniforms and some are in civilian attire. Next, please. Now you know if the Navy didn't think about training or uniforms, they didn't think about barracks. Where would these women be housed? The Navy didn't know and they didn't have a plan, generally speaking. Most of the women will commute from home, right? Shared housing, all lived in donated facilities, and I go into this in the pamphlet. Several notable people, members of Congress and some others, actually donated houses where the women could live. There was a severe housing shortage because of the war, especially in the nation's capital, which was the headquarters for the war effort. Therefore, they got benefits that allotted them additional money for housing and meals. No child hall to go to, right? Again, that was not good for them because I told you they worked, they had training, then they had to compete for a space at local cafes and restaurants for a seat. Them and all the other civilian workers in DC, all the government workers. So this problem replicated itself. So this image shows one of the very few Yeoman F. This is Marion F. Walsh, who's standing before her what they call living quarters in Boston, Massachusetts. But it was rare. Next. So what did they do? Again, the majority, as they were recruited for, are going to perform typing, filing, shorthand, and other types of clerical work at naval commands across the country and overseas. Here you see Yeoman F working with civilians at the Bureau of Supplies and Accounts at the main Navy building in Washington, D.C. That doesn't have a context for us today because it doesn't exist, right? But there was a huge main Navy building downtown on Constitution between 15th and 17th, and this is where they worked. Again, they also are going to serve, though, in the payroll department at the Bureau of Navigation in D.C., the Naval Gun Factory in the Washington Navy Yard, just to give you an example, and in something called the Cost Inspection Department in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So you name it, they did it. It's kind of like we said about waves in World War II. If you did business with the Navy in World War II, you did business with a wave. Somewhat similar, especially in the DC area. Next, please. Joy Bright Hancock, is that familiar to some of you all? Is she? Yeah, she's a hero of mine. Hancock delivered plans for the Superintendent Constructor's Office to the ships under construction in the New York Navy Yard. She was actually recruited by a naval officer, believe it or not, in her community, who told her that this would be a great idea. Later, she's going to record the proceedings from naval courts and boards as the personnel yeoman at NAS, Naval Air Station, Cape May, New Jersey. So she didn't go far from where she lived to serve her country. Between the wars, Hancock will work at the Bureau of Aeronautics, and she's going to help establish the Naval Aviation Magazine. She's also going to be the Waves Liaison Officer to the Bureau of Aeronautics during World War II. And if that wasn't enough, she's going to become the third director of the Waves in 1946, playing an instrumental role in the passage of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. And if you want to know more about her, her papers are at the Butler Library at the University of Georgia. And thankfully, she published an autobiography called Lady in the Navy, A Personal Reminiscence, in 1972. So here you see her in a World War I uniform, and then you also see her with a fellow former Yeoman F, Lieutenant Eunice White. And this picture was taken approximately in 1943. Next. Now, I'd be remiss if I only talked about their clerical duties, because they did a whole bunch more. The Yeoman F's work, especially those in naval intelligence, gave them a front seat to the war in real time. A few examples. 50 yeomen participated in espionage investigations at the Office of Naval Intelligence in New York. Mabel Pease transmitted messages to Admiral Sims, the U.S. Navy liaison, to London. Florence Westall charted enemy submarine activities. Lily and Bud translated messages from naval ships and commands and delivered them directly to President Woodrow Wilson and other members of his cabinet. Marion Taylor will monitor Allied ship movement, reports in the Atlantic Ocean. A small percentage of female reservists had assignments outside the United States, and that's in the territory of Hawaii, in Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Panama Canal Zone. Examples of what they did. Chief Yeoman Gibbon, for example, deployed to base hospitals, as another example, in Paris and in Brest, France, respectively. Hawaiian Francis Hoey worked at the Naval Attaché Office in Paris. And then Virginia Malaki left her position as a civilian stenographer in response to a call for clerical support in Hawaii. Next. Oh, okay. This is Chief Yeoman Daisy F. F is on my brain now. Chief Yeoman Daisy Mae Pratt Erd. She is one example, but certainly not the only one. Some of the officers and supervisors of these women were so impressed with them that they recommended, their commanding officers recommended them for promotion to officer rank. Think about that. This is 1917, 1918. They weren't wanted anyway. Oh, we don't have time. Anyway, this is amazing that this happened. Congressman James A. Gallivan, 12th District of Massachusetts, appealed directly to Daniels on Erd's behalf to advance to ensign. But Daniels, in his many replies to these requests, simply said, "I have no authority to approve such promotions." Yeah, you heard me right. Mr. Gill did it. Oh, we just don't have time today. Anyway, that was Daniels. That was Daniels. Okay, next. African American yeomen. How many of you know there were African American yeomen? Yeah. Oh, I got a hand back there. Okay. How did you learn of them?
I studied waves in World War II, and so just through research their previous what they did, I put that in my research.
Okay. Yep. And in both wars, it was a very small percentage, less than 1%. Yes, yes, yes. Well, you might wonder, how the heck did this happen? And I haven't quite figured it out, but I'm going to tell you what I do know. Despite the urgent need for personnel, Secretary Daniels did not recruit all available women. Recruiters turned away African Americans. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and other such organizations and individuals questioned this policy of exclusion in letters to Daniels. The irony of this policy was not lost as the country is waging war to keep the world safe for democracy. Daniels' decision to exclude qualified black women, though, was consistent with War Department policies that were discriminatory towards blacks, as well, with the War Department. Today we say Department of Defense, but then the War Department, and that was reflected in the Navy's policies. So, for example, African Americans in the Navy at this time were limited to the enlisted ranks, and they were limited to specific ratings. Okay, so we're not talking nuclear at this time, but think about coal heavers, think about messmen, think about stewards, think about stevedores, kind of manual duties, which is, don't have time, never mind. Now what happened, I'm not quite sure how this happened, but a fellow named John T. Reicher from Mississippi was a supervisor in the main Navy building in the muster roll division, a very important division in that organization. African American, John T. Reicher was somehow able to enlist 14 African American women. Not because the Navy policy changed. I have yet to discover how he did this. The family has their Reicher papers, which they share with some and not others. Some they put on their website. So I haven't been able to get access to that. Their service records are at the National Military Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, and all World War I veterans records are open, by the way. So I have looked at those. Anyway, the Yeoman F were held from 4 states, 7 from Mississippi, 4 from D.C., 2 from Texas, and 1 from Maryland. Do y'all remember Secretary of Commerce Ronald Brown? He was surprised to discover when he learned his grandmother was buried at Arlington, and he didn't know why. She was one of these Yeoman F. Cortland Malloy did a very nice piece with one of these women he did it because she had been married to her spouse for 50 plus years. So those are 2 sources that if you want to know a little bit more about them. Kelly Miller, a prominent educator and intellectual, noted that these black women in his book called The History of the World for Human Rights. Richard Miller, esteemed colleague, Morgan State graduate, retired Navy hospital corpsman, he authored his path-breaking article, which I would recommend to you, called The Golden 14 + 1 in the Minerva Journal. Minerva, to my knowledge, is still and remains the only journal devoted exclusively to women in the military, much like WMSA is. And if you haven't been to WMSA, please go. Women in Military Service for a Miracle Foundation. It's right at the entrance to Arlington Cemetery. If you want to walk through history and what women of the cloth, what a cloth of the nation have contributed, it's a wonderful place. They hold a lot of ceremonies there and conferences. Terrific place. But Richard's article kind of put this story back in the public. Next. Now, they weren't always working. This is an example of what Yeoman F would have to get to go on Liberty, a Liberty card you see here. Next. Here we see female yeomen in Washington, D.C. would enjoy concerts on the Mall and other local attractions. They'd also have picnics, played on Navy-sponsored competitive basketball, baseball, track, and swimming teams. I still haven't figured out how they did all of that with their duties, but they did. They also will do community service. One example is supporting the Salvation Army's donut drive and hosting field games with children at Central High School. They also will march in Liberty Bond parades. Here we see Yeoman F. Mabel M. Croft on board steamer Charles McAllister, bound from Washington, D.C. to Mount Vernon, Virginia. Still a great place to visit. Next. Some of the other activities, just a second. The type of recreational activities would vary from one command to another. So here we see Yeoman F. from Puget Sound Navy Yard who traveled to Spokane, Washington in September 1918 to take part in the Inland Empire Annual Fair, Fall Fair. Just to give you another example, Yeoman F. in Boston, Massachusetts participated in a naval regatta on the Charles River. Next. The Spanish influenza. Seems like we're there again, huh? That sign is an example of the impact that the influenza was having on the country and the world. Millions of people died around the world, literally. And if we have time, somebody asked me why it's called the Spanish flu, because it didn't originate in Spain. Anyway, it took millions of lives around the globe. No one was exempt. It struck 57 Yeoman F, 25 Navy nurses, 2 women Marines, the daughter of significant individuals, including Samuel Gompers, the great labor union leader. And when I was at Great Lakes to give a talk, I was given a terrific tour of the incredible, just acre after acre. But there's a cemetery there. And the Great Lakes commander during World War I, his daughter succumbed to it, and her grave is there as a baby. Loretta Perfecta Walsh, we talked about earlier, she became ill and recovered, but her exposure to the influenza shortened her life, and she dies from a related cause in 1925. So you can see she was quite young. Like today, the government urged citizens to wear masks, protect themselves, isolate the sick, avoid large gatherings, and bury victims quickly. How bad was this? They had trucks that went through the city to take the bodies from the house. That's how bad it was. And it's in the book. A Yeoman F recounts when she's on her way to duty, she just sees caskets just stacked up as far as she could see. Okay, so another problem. As the disease is going to progress, the troop transport ships that are delivering our troops and sailors overseas they're arriving with personnel in various stages of this disease, of the flu. So key impact. In fact, people compared this influenza to the plague. Now, in this caution sound, it's mounted on a wooden storage cable. This is at Naval Aircraft Factory, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But that says a lot. Next. Their contributions to the war were not overlooked, especially by Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. This is one of many tributes that he made to them. If you know his book, Our Navy at War, which is kind of his history of the Navy in World War I, he also has a tribute in there as well, good bit of a chapter. The Yeoman F will prove their worth many times over and receive well-earned accolades for their work from President Wilson and others. The quality of their work products and their overall contribution to the Navy's war effort led leaders to invite them to continue their duties as civilian employees. Why? They didn't want to lose the skill set. The Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, Rear Admiral L.C. Palmer, said this: "The civil service clerks and the men and women of the Reserve Yeoman Branch have given excellent service. It would have been impossible to carry on the duties of any of the bureaus or offices of the Navy Department had it not been for the efficient and loyal work of these men and women." Well, the war ends, the Navy will stop recruiting women and will demobilize them. The last Yeoman F was discharged in 1920. I didn't say it earlier, but they were signing up for a 4-year enlistment. So the Naval Appropriations Act of July 11th, 1919 placed all reservists, including females, on inactive duty, and they would receive $12 a year until they were officially discharged. Now, something that Congress did after World War I, after these alkaloids, these great compliments I just shared with you, we're coming to a close. The Naval Reserve Act of 1916 said any U.S. citizen could serve, correct? But guess what Congress did? They rewrote it to read that any male citizens could serve. That is why Congress had to create a place for women for the World War II Navy. I wish we had time. Okay, next please. That's a letter I found in the Eunice Desai papers. Eunice Desai wrote sort of a handbook that was published and widely used called the National Yeoman F. The source material for that book is in our archives. And this letter came from that collection. So I'm going to quote from it. This is a letter from Helen Holmes of Waynesboro, Virginia, to Helen G. O'Neill. And she wrote, this is an extract: "Thank you for the fine photograph of a yeomanette of 1917. It brought back many memories. Little did any of us think our experience would color the rest of our lives." Several of the yeomen met their spouses with whom they started families after the war. Their naval service gave them experiences that they couldn't even ordinarily have had or imagined. It enhanced their confidence, and in some cases increased their income. Like the men they replaced, they were very proud of their naval service and established friendships that spanned their lifetimes. Other females remarked, "I loved it and felt it was doing my bit." Another yeoman F wrote, "I will always be grateful for having served in the Navy." Another, "I wouldn't give up one single minute of my service." Next. Thanks for listening.
So for our question and answer portion, if you could speak up and introduce yourself. And we've got about 15 minutes until we'll need to wrap things up so the midshipmen can get off to class.
Thank you again for coming. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Dr. Abdullah here in the history department.
Mhm.
You mentioned that some of these women met their spouses while they were serving. Were they allowed to be married while they were serving?
No.
I think
That was also true in World War II.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Lieutenant Terrence Viernes. I'm also an instructor here at the history department. You mentioned how some women were recruited and then sent off to work immediately after signing the dotted line. Could you speak a little more about if they had some established pipeline for training or a way to on-ramp them into the service? Was something like that thought about at all?
Not at all. Most of the training was on the job and by way of manuals or there was no systematic effort to train them. Some commands did better than others. I mentioned the recruiting station at 10th and Pennsylvania Avenue. They actually had some kind of a curriculum, and there are examples of it in the DeSay papers that I mentioned. But generally speaking, no. And also bear in mind, these women were volunteering. Though it's been encouraged several times in our country's history, women have never been drafted. So they, not knowing what they were walking into, going against the current cultural standards for women, this is we're coming out of the Gilded Age, right? You get married, met a nice guy, had children, and then raised great sons who are going to do great things. Well, this goes against that. They also ran into what our women ran into in World War II. What kind of woman would want to be in the military? She must be either or, right? That was a popular sentiment. And yet they came. They came in great numbers to serve their country. Not drafted, couldn't be drafted, but that has been proposed several times, even by FDR when we were thinking about invading Japan. And one of his fireside chats, he mentioned that, he didn't mention we were going to think about invading Japan, obviously, but he did say that we should look into drafting women. And that wasn't the first time it was named. He had 2 members of Congress introduce it on the congressional floor. And if you want to get a good laugh, you can go into the congressional record and see some of the discussion that went on about that one. And sadly, not too different from what we've heard recently. And now, of course, we lost Ash Carter, right? Secretary of Defense Carter died yesterday and day before yesterday. And he opened up all combat. There's nothing a woman can't do that she can't qualify for. And that has again raised the issue about the draft, because if there are no limitations on what women can do, why aren't women and men drafted? The other issue that's come up is, should we have universal service? You've seen it in the paper, you've seen Congress debating it. Other countries do it, and they do it well. But this is America, so we'll see what happens. Yes?
Hey, Dr. Akers, Chris Costello from the History Department. What was the relationship between these women who served in the Navy and the suffrage movement?
Thank you. Many suffragists, including Joy Bright Hancock, her mother had suffrage meetings in their house. They came with a suffrage background. I don't know if you've seen that wonderful picture of suffragists outside the White House, because they're urging Wilson to support the suffrage movement, right? Wilson's from Virginia. He's conservative. He has certain perspectives on things, right? And so there were suffragists who did enlist and others who enlisted who supported it. And they hoped that their contribution during the war will persuade members of Congress and Wilson to give women the right to vote. But as we know, it took a minute for them to come around, but that was part of the agenda as well. But many of them were suffragists, active suffragists, which was not an easy thing to do at that time period. Yes?
Yeah, Dr. John Fahey, I have the desk next to yours.
Thank you again for coming.
So, I was curious, you mentioned obviously there's race restrictions on these women who join. You mentioned they come from all the states. Any particular class or social backgrounds that they're predominantly from?
No, not really. In the DeSay papers, there's a breakdown, and also if you look at the Secretary of Navy's annual reports, they're done every year, and under the Bureau of Navigation, anything you want to know about personnel is in there. I mean, it's minutia. It needs a computer database. But in there, they do indicate certain states drew more of them than others. So if you look at the DeSay papers, California shouldn't surprise you, Texas, what's another big state, Virginia? But they came from all walks of life. Some of them left high-paying jobs to come for that Navy pay. They actually had a decrease in income, but they did it for the sake of the war. And some of them had relatives who were serving, and they thought somehow they had a part to do too, and hopefully that whatever they could contribute would bring their loved ones home sooner. Yes, Charles? This is my boss, Charles Frodin.
I have a desk across the hall from John Henry. In one of the last slides that you threw up, you were talking on Spanish influenza. You were talking about the casualties, and you mentioned the number of yeomen Fs that lost their lives. but you also mentioned, I think you said 2 female Marines.
Yes.
So could you just speak? I didn't know that the Marine had actually enlisted women in the Corps.
Yes.
So could you speak to that just briefly?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
305 women were enlisted in the Marine Corps during World War I. I say 11,000 plus now women in the Navy. The Coast Guard had 3 twin sisters and then a third. And as I said, the Army was trying to figure out what they wanted to do before the war, and then the war ended. But the fact that these women came forward, it speaks to their courage, their patriotism, and it's not just now. It reflects a long legacy of times when women came forward in a civilian or military capacity to support our services. Go back to the Revolutionary War, one of Charles's specialties, where they would be washing down the cannons between shots. They would be camp followers in World War II. So this legacy goes way back. It's just a matter of when they were allowed to serve officially. So when we talk about women officially in the military, you're talking about first the Army Nurse Corps, 1901, Navy Nurse Corps, 1908. But the Army and Navy Nurse Corps performed very well throughout its history. In fact, they served having what we, I don't have time, but they served not having regular benefits. That didn't come along until World War II. That's why the head of the Navy Nurse Corps is the first female 06 in the Navy. They went from relative rank to regular rank. And then the Women's Armed Services Act of 48 gave them a place in the peacetime, in the regular Navy, the peacetime Navy. But like today, good bills get washed down in committee. There are several restrictions on women. Read that document carefully. Women can compose no more than 2% of the total force. Only one woman could be in the rank of 06. That's the director of the WAC, the WAVE, the Coast Guard SPARS, like that. One. So if you're wondering why we didn't have admirals before 72, there's a reason for that. Also, because this was done by Congress, guess who has to amend that every time we make a change? Congress. Ever so efficient Congress. So there were real restrictions on women that gave them that peacetime role, but within, and they could only, when you look at Korea, not just the wars, but the non-wartime events that our military engaged, that really took its toll. And we lost a lot of women after World War II and after Korea because there was no room for advancement. You can't have so many people coming as ensigns and then they're just stuck at lieutenant or lieutenant commander. That's a problem. And women weren't on ships yet. That didn't happen until 1972. Well, technically, the Women in Ships program started in 1978. So there was a problem there. Yes?
Ma'am, Midshipman 4th Class Baker, you showed a picture of Joy Bright Hancock, and she was wearing what looked like STBs. Was she an officer or a senior enlisted?
In World War I, she's enlisted, of course. We didn't have any officers, female officers in the Navy Nurse Corps either. But in World War II, that photograph there,
Yes.
she is lieutenant commander.
So how did she make the transfer from enlisted to officer?
Well, she's discharged after World War I. Remember I said that, and then and how they got a stipend until they were officially discharged. She's going to get what we call a direct, well, you know, a direct commission. I'm used to talking to civilians, sorry. A direct commission into the Navy. She's going to be almost handpicked by Mildred McAfee, who was the first director of the WAYS, formerly president of Wesley College and the director of the WAYS for most of the war. Because of her exposure, wrong choice of words, because of her work with the Bureau of Aeronautics, thank you, Charles, with the Bureau of Aeronautics, she was a perfect pick to be a liaison with the Bureau of Aviation. There was a WAVE liaison for all the bureaus within the Navy Department. She also, by the way, was responsible, this is going to sound crazy to you, but most training during World War II for women was segregated. They didn't serve with men, except for Joy Hancock, who was very responsible that almost 30% of all WAVES, and there were 100,000 plus, will be in aviation. And she insisted that the training be integrated. Because she said if a pilot has a question, he needs to be comfortable with her and she needs to be comfortable with him. That's an unknown fact about World War II. Right? Some of our services took a long time to catch up with that one. But she's responsible for the integrated training of WAVES who were in aviation during World War II.
She's phenomenal. I mean, a pillar in the history. Yes?
Akers, thank you so much for being here today. Michael McCann from Nimitz Library.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sure. You mentioned that some of the yeomen actually served overseas, I assume in the European theater for World War I. About, how many are we talking about, and did they stay? Were they there for a set period of time, or was it indefinite?
Well, like any other person in the Navy, they'd have orders for a specific period of time. Probably not for the duration of the war, because like anybody else, your orders would turn over. So I mentioned they were at field hospitals. They were associated, one was a naval attaché in Paris. I worked with the naval attaché office in Paris. I would have to, if you email me, I'll see if I can get you a number, and a more specific, concise number on that. I don't know it standing here, but that's a very good question.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Joe Greco, I'm a visiting faculty member from Cal State in California. And I've read there are places, certain monographs that identify some of the discrimination these women faced after the war was over. They had now developed these skills, but once they tried to enter the civilian workforce, did you find any discrimination? How strong was it?
Excuse me, you're talking about World War I?
Both.
Post World War I? I haven't for World War II, and I would be surprised by that, but I'm sure they faced some. Again, despite their many contributions and all the accolades they received, there's still women in our society, and there's certain societal expectations. And then there was the thing of, well, if the women take the jobs, they're taking jobs from men, right? Some things never change. And that was another problem. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did encounter some discrimination. And one of the other ways, I should have mentioned, we didn't have time today, but in the male-female gender relations, I have a little bit of that in the pamphlet, and that's just reduced because of the size of the pamphlet, but a lot of the males who initially resented these women coming in, it was hard to make rank in our Navy in the late 1900s and the early 20th century, right? And so for me to show up as a second class or a first class without time at sea, do the math on that one. So it wasn't so much about their gender. It was like, who the blank do you think you are? I'm waiting to make third class, or I'm waiting to make chief. And some of these women came in the rank of chief because of the credentials that they brought in, that they had when they enlisted. That caused real resentment. The other thing is, if these women come in and do well enough, and you and I are in the office, or the three of us are in the office, and I do my job well enough, eventually one of you is going to be deployed, right? Do you like that? No, you like your job in Washington or wherever you are within the United States. So then there's that too. So several things strained gender relations between the women during the war. But I wouldn't be surprised about that factor for the reasons that I cited at all. For World War I anyway, I can't speak to World War II.
We are out of time. Midshipmen need to get to class now, so
Thank you all
please
for
join
coming.
me in thanking Dr. Akers.